Hello, come closer. I want to get the Coelophysis in here. He's such a cool dinosaur. Look at him. How sick is that? So as long as he's in frame, I think we're gonna be okay. Let's talk about mountain monograms. So I grew up in Arizona, and I was right next to a mountain. There's a lot of mountains in Arizona, but I grew up next to one that had some big letters on it, and I didn't really think much of it growing up at all. I just knew that it had to do something with my local high school. But it turns out these things do have a name. They're called hillside letters or mountain monograms. I'm gonna refer to them as mountain monograms because I like the alliteration. But our state, Arizona, we got a lot of these things. There's kind of just an unofficial list of mountain monograms on Wikipedia, and according to it, Arizona has the fourth most of any state. We have 63, and if you want to include a fictional one, we technically have 64. There's Radiator Springs, which is from Cars, and that takes place apparently somewhere in eastern Arizona. That's where Radiator Springs is. But basically, mountain monograms are typically just like painted right onto the mountain. They're painted directly onto the rock, or they're like made of concrete and then painted over. But they're just these huge, big letters. And the reason I got interested in them is just because I wanted to know why. Where did it come from? How did that tradition start? Turns out that history is pretty fascinating. And the person who taught me about it was equally as interesting. His name is the Deuce of Clubs. He made this website. Like one of the first things I did when I looked up just mountain monograms on Google, this was one of the first websites that popped up. The Deuce of Clubs. He made this website called Mountain Monograms, and he was coming at it from the same angle that I was. He was just like, hey, I grew up in Arizona, and I wanted to know how this tradition started. Where did it come from? So that was his mission. But over the course of trying to figure that out, he basically created this online community. This was all happening in like the early 2000s. And I mean, you can see the website, it looks like it's from the early 2000s, which isn't a knock on it. It's pretty like fun and charming. But he basically forms this community because all these people start sending him photos of mountain monograms in their town. And he basically just has an archive of all these photos of mountain monograms from across the country. But while this is all happening, he eventually gets put in touch with a professor who gives him information on where he can find out how mountain monograms came to existence. And on the website, you can actually see the email exchange that he had with a professor called Paul Stars, who basically directs the Deuce of Clubs to an article written by an advisor that he had, that Stars used to have, from UC Berkeley. Deja vu, we're gonna read another UC Berkeley research article. It's called Hillside Letters in the Western Landscape, and it's gonna be much of the focus of this video. So, how did mountain monograms become a thing? So it all starts in 1905 with the Big C on Charter Hill. This is at UC Berkeley. It's a big, like 60-foot concrete C that's on the side of a mountain. And the reason why it was built surprised me, because I just assumed that all these things were meant to be like, class spirit. Kind of, but it's actually because they were trying to diffuse class rivalries. Because apparently, at the time, the tension between classes, like the fighting that was breaking out between freshmen and sophomores, was really, really getting violent. So there was this tradition at UC Berkeley called the Rush. And what would happen is, like every single year, the sophomores and the freshmen would meet on Charter Hill and basically they would just fight. They would just fight each other. It was meant to be a big old wrestling match, and some source said that like the sophomores would try and roll the freshmen back down the hill. But it kind of devolved into like this big fight that would just happen like randomly throughout the campus. So it wasn't just even confined to Charter Hill anymore. And this was a tradition that had been going on since the 1860s. And it had gotten so bad that it was actually doing damage to UC Berkeley's reputation. So I quote from the article here: "The traditional brawl between the two classes had degenerated into something close to guerrilla warfare, a kind of primal savagery known as the Rush, that was likened by one contemporary to Anglo-Saxon raids on the British coast," which is quite hyperbolic, but nevertheless. "The intramural battles were receiving increasingly lurid press coverage, discrediting the university throughout the state. Legislative appropriations and alumni giving were threatened." So yeah, it was bad enough to where UC Berkeley was literally like being threatened financially. So UC Berkeley, their staff, they're like, hey, we need to bring this to an end. So they have an idea. They're like, hey, we're going to get the freshman and sophomore classes to work on a project together. So they pull the freshman class of '07 and the sophomore class of '08, and they make them build this mountain monogram together. And the mountain monogram was meant to be a truce. It was the symbol of class unity. And what was interesting is that all these traditions that I now think about when I think of mountain monograms today really came from the Big C. The freshman class every single year would go up and paint it. And then the sophomore class, whenever they were having a big football game against Stanford, who are their main rivals, they would go up and basically guard the C because Stanford students would try and come over and deface it. And I mean, that happens all the time now with mountain monograms at other universities. But it turns out the Big C was controversial. A lot of people did not seem to like it. And actually, one of my favorite quotes from this whole article comes from this mathematics professor. His name is A.W. Whitney. He protested that living in contemplation of this kind of vulgarity, students would soon be painting C's on Yosemite's El Capitan. And why not? Why is it worse? The Berkeley Hills, in their way, are just as fine as Yosemite. I mean, that's not true. I've seen photos of like the Berkeley Hills, because when I read this quote, I was like, okay, how pretty are they actually? They're gorgeous, but they're not like this. And either way, that's a really big slippery slope. But he goes on to say, our wantonness would be in the eyes of the world. We cannot afford to stand for such vulgarity. Don't you just love how people used to talk in the early 1900s? It was so formal. And then there were also some groups in the local area that were like, hey, you know, the mountain monogram, it's gonna completely deface the look of our mountain. You know, why are we doing this? Think about the natural scenery and the environment. But the plan still went through anyways. So this starts at UC Berkeley, but then the tradition just spreads from there. So in 1906, the second mountain monogram ever made was at BYU, Brigham Young University, and they built a Y on a mountain next to their campus, and it was 320 feet high. And then the year after that, the University of Utah builds a big U on its mountain. And there's a little connection here that I thought I noticed, but it didn't really come up in the article, it wasn't mentioned. But it seems like it really starts to spread this tradition because of rivalries between schools. And I say that because I was like, okay, so you're telling me it goes from one university in Utah and then to another university in Utah. Is there a chance that they're rivals? And the answer is yes. BYU and the University of Utah, they have it actually has a name. Their rivalry is called the Holy War because both student populations are like majority Mormon. Fun fact, BYU is actually owned by the Church of Latter-day Saints. I did not know that. So it's like, okay, yeah, once the University of Utah students saw that BYU had a big, you know, like Y on its mountain, they were like, dude, we gotta get one of these too. And they're not the only universities that did that. My university almost certainly did that too, because the University of Arizona has a big A on its mountain. And that happened in 1915. And then just a couple years later, my school, Arizona State University, we put a big N on our mountain. And the reason why it was an N was because at the time we were called the Tempe Normal School, and then we actually changed it to a T, to Tempe State Teachers College, a few years after that when we changed our name. And then we changed it again to A when we became Arizona State Teachers College. So ours went through a few different iterations. I do want to talk about our A Mountain for a moment because you do see a lot of the same traditions that were started at UC Berkeley. Every year we have an event where the freshman class goes up and paints it white, and then right before the first home game, football game of the year, it's painted gold. And it also becomes a target whenever we have our rivals over U of A for a football game. Like, it's been defaced many times by the University of Arizona students. And actually, this was pretty crazy. It got pipe bombed in 1952. The people who did it were never caught, but there's a lot of suspicion that it was actually just U of A students. And so in response, after it got blown up, we rebuilt it with steel and concrete. Never again, never again. So just 10 years after the Big C is built, there were 20 mountain monograms at universities across the country. And at the time of the publication of this article, there were about 250 mapped in the 1980s. And now the tradition has spread from outside of just universities. High schools do it all the time. Some towns just make their own mountain monograms. But what I wanted to know, because everything does have to be a competition, is who has the biggest one? Because I only have one lead, and it's the Wikipedia entry for the mountain monograms in California, which claims that Lassen High School in Susanville has the biggest mountain monogram at 600 feet long. And I was like, okay, that sounds cool. Can I see it? And so I went on Google Maps and I went to Susanville. And first off, when I plopped myself down on that little Google Street View, you can take your little yellow guy and just kind of drop him. I put myself in the middle of the street right in front of Lassen High School, and there was not a single mountain. So I spent a lot of time just kind of scrolling around the city, just looking at all the cute little coffee shops they have. I ended up in Hobo Camp at one point. Cute little campground though. And then what I ended up doing is I just scrolled out and I went north of the city, and that's where I saw the big L. It could be the biggest one in the country, but who knows? And that's my mission. I'm gonna try and figure out what the biggest mountain monogram in the country is. Is it undocumented? Is there no anything about it online? So if you happen to know, feel free to comment about it. Maybe your town has the biggest mountain monogram in the nation. But I did actually email somebody who I thought might know about it. I emailed the Deuce of Clubs on Thanksgiving. He hasn't gotten back to me, but I might try and reply to him here again soon. And if he does, I will make a video about it. So yeah, that's the deal. That's what I wanted to talk about with mountain monograms. Pretty cool little thing with an interesting history. I had a lot of fun doing research for this video. It's always cool to figure out these little niche history topics. But I hope you learned something today, and have a good one. Bye-bye.